It's episode 213 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Find all of the archives of the show over at hankgarner.com, and when you're there, please click on the link in the right-hand sidebar and subscribe to the show. I'd like to tell you about some sponsors today. Russell Blake and his book Day After Never, Blood Honor, the first book in the post-collapse series that Hugh Howey called the best post-apocalyptic series I've read in ages. When the world ends, I hope this book survives. Can't wait for the sequel. Well, you don't have to wait because you can get into the series now and read all 6 books. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, Pico's House. Hey, authors, are you looking to take your book to the next level? Talk to my friend Crystal Pico Watanabe from Pico's House. She offers developmental editing, line editing, beta reading, and proofreading. She'll soon be launching a book interior design service, print formatting, and things like that. But you can inquire about it now. She's edited over 70 novels and novellas and 130 short stories. And she comes recommended by best-selling authors such as Hugh Howey and Samuel Peralta. Most of her experiences with science fiction, speculative fiction, and middle-grade fantasy, but she enjoys all genres and will do you an awesome job. She offers a complimentary 2-page sample edit and complimentary track changes review after the edit. PicosHouse.com, and let her know you heard about it on Author Stories. Also, Dominion Rising is finally here. 23 all-new, never-before-released epic novels of fantasy and sci-fi, all for only 99 cents. This set is the talk of the industry right now, so grab your copy before you're left behind. Dominion Rising. There's a link to it in the show notes. Galactic Satori Chronicles, written by Nick Breaker and Paul E. Hicks. This raucous sci-fi adventure introduces Asher, a young man whose world is turned upside down when he discovers that his fiance's death has been directly caused by an imminent alien invasion. He and his friends channeled his anger and grief into the ultimate weapon against alien technology. Human emotions were the one thing the Kron didn't account for when they started their attack on Earth. Book 1 Earth and Book 2 Kron are now available. Galactic Satori Chronicles. My friend Stefan Boltz has a new book called Six String. Jennifer Dalton dreamed of being a singer for as long as she could remember. The dream has kept her alive throughout a childhood mixed in poverty and a broken and abusive home. When her younger brother dies and her mother takes refuge in alcohol, the emotional toil becomes unbearable. One morning she runs away, taking with her the one thing she owns, her beloved six-string guitar. This is the story of a girl finding herself alone in the good and the bad, the friends she makes, and a choice that can rob her of everything she's won. Six String by Stefan Boltz. Also, Series 2525. In Series 2525, you fly along on the sci-fi action adventure of Ceres Tari, a 25-year-old playboy superstar of the Zero Gravity League. He's desperately searching for his mother, long held captive among the galaxy's 500 worlds. When he too is kidnapped by a pirate fleet, forced to duel to the death to save a slave with powerful secret abilities, he determines to fight his way up the pirate ranks. Can Ceres kill his father to rescue his mother? Who will save his soul from himself? Fun science fiction with heart, Series 2525 is the must-read book of the summer. Don't miss out. There's a link to it in the show notes. Also, my good friend R.A. McCandless, his book Tears of Heaven, The Flames of Perdition, Book 1. A child of angels and humans, Dell is a sarcastic, fast-talking, dangerous, and unpredictable demon hunter. She and her partner, Marin, take their orders directly from an angel. They obey, or they'll be destroyed. It's not the job Dell wants, but it's the job she has. Normally, banishing a rogue demon back to hell wouldn't be a problem. Dell and Marin have a few centuries of experience. It's all part of the job description. But when the angel orders them to take down 3 demons at once, the job goes from bad to worse. The demons with supernatural powers and their own agenda have kidnapped children for their own nefarious ends. With angels breathing down her neck, children to save, and demons gunning for her blood, Dell is running out of time. That's exactly where she wants to be. I cannot recommend this book enough. This is urban fantasy at its very best. Tears of Heaven, The Flames of Perdition, Book 1 by R.A. McCandless. Are you looking forward to The Defenders on Netflix? I know I am. My friend Ed Gosney at edgosney.com runs one of the best comics websites around, and his blog is called Cool Comics in My Collection, and it's a little different than some of the other sites out there because Ed focuses on comics in his collection, bringing you some really cool information about it, and also talking about comics that may have slipped away, and really talking about collecting from the view of someone who loves comics. And it's always topical, and that's why I asked you about the Defenders, because this week Ed talked about some of the best comics to get into if you're looking forward to the Netflix show Defenders. So go over to edgosney.com, learn something, and get plugged into collecting comics. edgosney.com. While you're there, why don't you pick up one of Ed's books? He's one of the best writers I know. And if you're into audiobooks, a couple of his novels are available on audio right now. I promise you will not be let down by anything he's got there. Cool Comics, My Collection, edgosney.com. Stay tuned after the show for an audiobook clip from Richard Glebe's Jason Crane series, and thank you to all the sponsors for making the show possible. Now on to our show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Christopher Valin on the show with me. Christopher wrote a book, probably my introduction to his work, except for in some anthologies and stuff that he's been in, and a couple of those that we've shared some stories in. But my real introduction to his work was his book Sidekick. And if you've listened to the show for any amount of time, you know I'm a huge comics nerd. And comics were this thing that I grew up reading, and they had a very formative impact on me. And when I was grown, I got away from reading comics and went a lot of years without reading any. And then as my oldest son got older, he started getting into comics, and I got back into it with him. And, I discovered, after being away for probably 20 years, not only some really great storylines in comics themselves going on, but people that were taking the genre, the superhero genre, the kind of magical realism and all of that, and really doing some really cool stuff in the literary space. And Christopher's book Sidekick is one that I just absolutely loved. And so that was my introduction to him, and have since gotten to know him pretty well, and just love his work. So I just wanted to have him on the show today. Welcome to the show, Christopher.
Morning or afternoon. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome.
Thanks for the kind words.
Oh yeah, well we're on kind of opposite coasts, so it's morning and afternoon depending on which end you're on. But anyway, I begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what's your first memory of wanting to be a writer or a storyteller?
I actually was probably maybe 7 or 8 years old, and I started making my own comic books. I hadn't really thought about being a writer so much as just wanting to draw the stories, and so I would have to come up with the stories to draw, and I guess I was writing without realizing I was writing. And but yeah, I was in elementary school, maybe first or second grade, when I started doing that. Go ahead.
Had you been reading comics for a while then?
Yeah, I started reading comics when I was really young, starting with some of those great big treasuries editions, they used to call them. They were huge, like 11 by 17 or something.
Yeah.
Reprints of regular sized comic books. And I remember having those as far back as my memory goes. So I don't know when I started reading them, but, when I was real little, I would look at the pictures, and then as I got older, it helped me learn to reading comic books. And then I wanted to do my own, starting at a very young age. And my dream was to be a comic book artist for quite a while when I was a kid.
I love those reprints. That used to be a real thing when we were kids. I remember we had a small-ish bookstore in the mall in the town that we lived close to. And, it's the town I grew up near is like 45,000 people, so not a big town by any stretch of the imagination, but we had a decent bookstore. It was a mall bookstore. I think it was called Bookland, or one of those chains. And and they didn't sell comics because comics then were sold, on spinner racks in the back of gas stations and stuff.
Yeah.
But they sold these great books full of reprints and stuff. And I remember, I think that was my introduction to Archie probably. And they did these Beetle Bailey, and I would just collect those, and those are fantastic. And I had no idea that I was reading stuff that was probably 20 years old at the time. It was just kind of rehash stuff. It was all new to me, and I loved it. I wish they still did those.
Yeah, I guess trade paperbacks kind of took over that niche for comic reprints nowadays.
Yeah,
they can charge a lot more for them.
Yeah, well, and comics got really serious. There's still some that are just plain fun, but they tend to be pretty heady stuff these days.
Yeah, they do.
So you wanted to be a comic artist. Like, did you have were you inclined to draw as well?
Yeah, I've always been an artist. I was never quite good enough to be a professional comic book artist. Although, well, I shouldn't say that. I was a professional inker for a little while.
Really?
But I was never good enough to be a penciler on my own. So, once I got old enough to really start submitting work and taking it to conventions and showing it and so forth, I would just see the other artists and realize that I had some talent, but not quite to the level of getting hired to do pencils. So I started concentrating on inking, and I did manage to get hired by some smaller comic book companies, Petra Comics, AK Comics. I did some work for Arrow Comics as an inker. So I was a comic book artist.
Nice.
I did live my dreams to a certain extent. I didn't get to pencil those stories, but inking was really exciting too.
That's really cool. Do they still pencil and ink by hand? Or is that kind of a Photoshop thing now?
There are some inkers still. I think it depends on the artist and the company. I've been out of business for over 10 years now, but I think mostly they do it on computers, just like the lettering and coloring now. So I don't know how many inkers still work by hand anymore. I know there's some out there. But I know that even when I was doing it, the jobs were getting thin because a lot of pencilers were just, scanning their work in and cleaning it up.
Right.
The whole point of inking was, the old print process was, pretty primitive in the early 1900s. And they had to really make the lines dark and they would show up, but they don't really need to anymore.
Right. Well, as a... what happens to a lot of us as we start growing older, and when we hit mid-teenage years in high school and stuff like that, there are a lot of things that compete for our attention. Sometimes it's sports, sometimes it's girls, sometimes it's cars, whatever it is. And comics are one of those things that we learn to kind of slide under our bed and kind of shy away from sometimes. Did you go through that, or did you were an artist, so you're thinking in that space, which is something I never was. Was it something that you put away for a while, or was this something that you were constantly saying, I'm going to keep working this craft because this is something I'm going to do?
I still wanted to be an artist, but it was more along the lines of maybe like a Frank Frazetta kind of stuff at that point in high school. I did. I remember my sophomore year of high school, I got a new group of friends and I started playing music. And of course, girls were a big interest too. And it was easier to get girls playing in a band than being a comic nerd. So I did for the last 3 years of high school, I stopped reading comic books. And then when I was in college, I went back to it. So I would say there's about a 3 to 4 year period where I kind of put comics to the side and didn't pay a lot of attention to them. But I went back pretty quickly once I was in college.
What did you play in the band?
I played bass guitar, and I played back then. This was the '80s. I played in heavy metal bands, pretty heavy, and then throughout the 90s, I played professionally in rock bands. It got mellower as I got older. So went from heavy metal to classic rock to blues rock. And then I moved to California in '99, and I just always intended on joining a band, and it just never happened. And now it's been almost 20 years.
Oh, wow.
And I just haven't played anymore since then.
So I just kind of assumed that you grew up in California. Where did you grow up?
My dad worked for the government, and we moved around quite a bit. I was born in Massachusetts, and when I was in elementary school, I moved to Colorado, Littleton, where Columbine is. Then we moved back to Massachusetts, and then we moved to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then to Colorado Springs when I was in college, and then as an adult, I moved to California.
Wow. We lived in Colorado Springs about 15, 17 years ago when our middle daughter was born. We lived there for a couple of years. It's an interesting place.
It sounds like you moved there right when I moved away.
Yeah, it was 9/11 happened when we lived there.
Oh,
so yeah, it was pretty crazy with all the military bases around there. It was an interesting time.
It's surrounded.
Yeah. As a kid that moved around a lot, like it sounds like you did, or definitely moved around more than I did, did reading and books have a kind of a normalizing factor on you?
Oh, absolutely. I had to have that stuff. I would always have comics, and I would always have books, and I think I read the Lord of the Rings trilogy 3 or 4 times all the way through. And I was, not only did we move around a lot, but I was painfully shy when I was a kid. I'm still pretty shy in person. So I wasn't the kind of person that could just move into a new place and make new friends right away and kind of slide into things. And so it really helped me, with being, kind of a loner and kind of a nerd. And, nowadays it's not so bad. It's actually can be an advantage to be kind of that way. But back then it was definitely not, the top of the heap there.
Yeah.
Being into comics and stuff like that.
There's this really interesting bisection that seems to happen with artistic people, whether you're a writer or a graphic artist or whatever. There seems to be bleed over between things that you love and types of expression. So a lot of writers are also musicians. A lot of writers are also artists of other sorts. And, it seems like that we usually are gifted in more than one area, or maybe it's just that the way we compartmentalize things is weird. Maybe artistic people are just artistic, and then we try to put people in boxes. I don't know which, that maybe it's just the way you look at it. But, as someone that's shy, also, that there's also this weird combination that happens. People that have this gift of self-expression, usually find very public ways of doing that, even though they don't like it. So a lot of musicians are painfully shy. A lot of writers, we like to hold things very close to our chest, and we like to write very deep and personal things that we want anybody to see until we publish it, and then we put it out for the whole world to see. It's this really weird thing that, have you ever thought about that?
I haven't, but you make absolutely totally makes sense. Really opened my eyes to that.
Oh, yeah. So are you still playing music at all?
I play around on my bass, and I have a guitar, and my kids are very musical. My son plays guitar, and my daughter sings and plays piano, and just learning ukulele. So, I still sometimes pick up the instruments with them, but I don't play professionally or even in a band or anything like that anymore.
Love it. Another thing that really fascinates me is what people decide to do career-wise when they are, pursuing artistic expression. And a lot of people, are full-time writers and things like that, but they didn't just immediately decide to go do that. So what did you decide to do for when it was time to go to college? What kind of career path did you see yourself going down?
My original idea was to be a lawyer. So I took history. They didn't have pre-law at the University of New Mexico when I first started college. So you just chose, whatever major, and I chose history. And I was planning on going to law school, but after I finished, I wasn't so sure about it. So I actually ended up going to business school for a year after I got my bachelor's degree and became a paralegal to see if I liked it. And so I was a paralegal for a few years. And but I started getting an idea that I might want to be a teacher while this was all going on. And in Colorado Springs at the time, there was only one teaching program, University of Colorado Springs. And it was a full-time program, like Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 or something. And I just couldn't do that at the time. So eventually I got in a position where I was able to go back to school and become a teacher. And I still teach, actually. I teach social studies in high school. And I love writing, and I also love teaching. So,
what was it that initially drew you to teaching?
For one thing, I've always loved working with kids and young people, and I love imparting knowledge to people. And I think I come across as a know-it-all a lot of times with my friends. I don't know how they put up with me. And I guess being able to have a job where that's what I'm supposed to be doing is really good for me. It's another form of kind of expression, and I feel like if I'm able to help other people and teach them about things that I know about, and I can pass it on to them, then it's very gratifying for me.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me about your 5 times great-grandfather.
Okay. So my grandfather, when he passed away, he gave my dad some family history stuff that I had never known about. And my dad gave it to me because I was kind of interested in that stuff. And it turned out that his great-grandfather, I guess, was a guy named Sir Howard Douglas, who was governor of New Brunswick, Canada, back in the early 1800s. And he had been a pretty famous guy over in England. And so I was doing some research on him, and I was doing our family history on ancestry.com. And it turned out that his dad, I found out, was even more famous. He was a guy named Rear Admiral Sir Charles Douglas. He was a British captain during the Revolutionary War. And he was pretty instrumental in a lot of things that happened during the war. But most people have never heard of him. I think people in Canada may be more familiar with him than people in the United States. But I just started to become fascinated with his story because he had done so much, and people at the time, newspaper articles at the time, everyone knew who he was, and he was a giant figure. And then nowadays, nobody had ever heard of him, and I was related to him and had never even heard of him. So when I went back to school to get my master's degree, I was getting it in military history, and so I started writing papers on my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, Sir Charles Douglas, and then I ended up doing my master's thesis on him, and eventually wrote a book about him. That was my first book that got published. It was published by a small press, Fireship Press, about 10 years ago. So he was a fascinating guy.
What was the name of that book?
It's called Fortune's Favorite, Sir Charles Douglas and the Breaking of the Line. So there's military maneuver that ships used back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, called Breaking the Line, and it was very controversial. It was controversial on whether or not they should be using it, and it was there was this huge battle called the Battle of the Saints at the end of the Revolutionary War between the British and the French, and Sir Charles Douglas was credited by some people with coming up with the idea to use that maneuver in order to win the battle, but his superior officer, Sir Rodney, actually got credit for it. And Sir Howard Douglas, the first ancestor I learned about, had written an entire book about it called Naval Evolutions, and presented all kinds of evidence that it was Sir Charles who deserved the credit. And there was a big to-do about it in the early 1800s. And again, it's been mostly forgotten. So that was a major part of my book that I wrote. And I also convinced the publisher to publish a new version of Sir Howard's book, Naval Evolutions, and so I produced that new version. I edited it, and I annotated it, wrote a new introduction, put it together to get it published.
How cool! People sometimes, when they're talking to writers, they're like, "Where do you get ideas from?" And I'm like, well, have you ever just sat down and talked to your family? Have you talked to, your grandparents or, some of the folks around you that have been around a while? There are stories everywhere. The writer's problem is not a lack of ideas. It's the culling those ideas and making an engaging narrative out of it. Maybe that's a problem. Maybe that's a challenge. But coming up with ideas is not the problem. There are fascinating people and fascinating stories all around us. And we may choose to write a memoir like you did, about your great grandfather, or, maybe that's fodder for, that takes a new piece of fiction, in a new way. Mm-hmm. But that's fascinating. I love that. I'm kind of the family historian in our family. When people find old junk from, grandparents or great grandparents, they give it to me because I collect all that stuff. And, I have, records of, my grandmother's family's farm from, the turn of the 20th century, and, all their old farm records and all that stuff. And it's just, junk to most of them. But a lot of that stuff went into my book Mulligan, that, all of those, journals and things like that. When I'm writing about a farm in the Depression, all that stuff was right there at hand. And, so that's awesome. I love that you did that. Was writing memoir or kind of a history, was that a different skill set from the fiction that you went on to write?
Yeah, it really was. I think I was always pretty good at writing, historical narratives and research papers and stuff like that. I was even way back in middle school. I remember I've written a paper in, I think, 8th grade that my teacher just raved about. So that came more naturally to me, I think. And I don't think I was even ever taught it really, other than back then, when I transferred schools from University of New Mexico to University of Colorado, they wanted me to take a research and writing class that was required, that hadn't been required at my old school. And I just, I showed them some of the papers I wrote, and they just waved it for me because they didn't think I needed it. So that came more naturally. The writing fiction, it started more. It kind of came through creating my own comic books. So I was an inker for a comic book company, a small comic book company, and I started writing stories to go, for the company. And then after producing comic book scripts, I realized that television scripts were almost the same thing. And back then, Star Trek accepted spec scripts from people. So I wrote a Deep Space Nine script. That was one of my first big works of fiction I've done, and then that moved on to writing scripts for other spec scripts for other TV shows that I liked, and then I wrote some feature screenplays, and I was winning some contests and stuff. But I didn't really think about writing stories so much in fiction books until around 10 years ago. There was an officially sponsored Star Trek fan fiction contest, and it was Kirk versus Picard, and I won. There were 4 weeks. We put together a script basically in 4 weeks, and it was actual people from Star Trek were involved. Writers from Star Trek. Will Wheaton was involved, and George Takei was involved, and there were 4 winners, and then the 4 acts got put together into one script, and I had won one of those weeks. And then I was asked by someone else who was involved in the contest if I would be interested in writing some short stories, because he wanted to put together some anthologies, and that was the first real attempts I had made at writing just kind of prose fiction. And that didn't come as naturally to me as the research and writing part, or even the screenwriting part.
Well, I can imagine. But as someone who is a real history buff and who writing, kind of the research oriented stuff was really kind of your wheelhouse. What did you find when you started writing fiction? What did you find that was different in the creative process that you really had to focus on?
I think coming up with, when I'm doing research, I'm just kind of taking what is already there and analyzing it and putting it together in different ways, and then kind of representing it or presenting it in a new light. Whereas, obviously with fiction, I'm mostly coming up with things out of my own head. And I think that, for one thing, it takes me a lot longer because I have to obviously think of what I'm going to put down. And then I have to also figure out which ideas I'm going to. So, right now I'm writing a sequel to Sidekick, and it's almost done, and I just decided to change one of the major points in the book, and I came up with this idea, and then it started kind of bouncing around in my head, and that took me a long time to figure out whether I wanted to use it or it was better than the old one. And with writing history, I don't really feel like I have to do that. I just, if the information's there may be 2 sides of the story, and I present both sides and say which one that I agree with or whatever, but it's all there. I don't have to come up with anything out of my own head.
You just have to find an engaging way to tell that story.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, speaking of Sidekick, where did that book come from, and how did you decide, from someone who's been a lover of comics all your life, to wanting to tell that kind of story, but in a prose format?
My original idea for Sidekick was going to be a screenplay, because that's mostly what I had still been writing at the time, and I thought it would be interesting to show a story from the Sidekick's point of view, and they've had Robin comic books and other Sidekick comic books in the past, but as far as TV shows or movies or complete novels, there may be some, but I've never seen them myself, and I just thought that there was there were probably a lot of young people out there that would like to see someone their age, rather than always having the adult
Right.
heroes in there, and so I started writing as a screenplay. But then I thought, I'd been thinking about writing a novel because I'd been doing short stories for anthologies for a while by that point. And then I thought, maybe I should give it a shot. Maybe this would be, my idea that would work as a complete novel. So I started trying to write it to see how it would go, and it went pretty well. I felt from the beginning, and it just started flowing naturally. And the other thing was, at the time I was working on another project, a screenplay project, and I kept wanting to go back to sidekick all the time. So this was just something I was doing on my own time, and the screenplay project was something I was working on for pay for a company. And I didn't want to do the pay one. I wanted to go back to my novel writing and use this idea. And the ideas just kept flowing for me. So I knew I was probably on the right track. I also had always wanted to tell my own superhero stories. Most of my anthology stories, even when they weren't supposed to be for superhero anthologies, ended up either superhero stories or kind of superhero-ish stories. So I thought, well, why don't I just go for it all the way? And of course, because Batman had been my favorite character my whole life, I knew it was going to be heavily influenced by that. I thought about running away from it and trying to go in the opposite direction, and then I thought, that's what I want to write, so I'm going to write it, and I'll come up with my own ideas and make my own characters, but it's obviously heavily influenced by the Batman mythos. But I think everything's influenced by other stories. So
sure, we all that's what stories are, is our own interpretations of things and our own ways of we talk about all the time, especially fantasy writers that I'll have on the show. We're all using the same toolbox. We're all talking about elves and orcs and wizards and all of that, and we're taking the same little toy box, but we're telling vastly different stories. But there's something about taking existing tropes, if you will. I don't really like that word, but everybody knows what I mean when I say that. You take those existing things, and then you don't have to explain everything to the reader. They know what they're dropping into, and you can just kind of hit the ground running with the story and not have to build a world. That's
exactly right. That's one of the reasons I wanted to do it. I wanted to, because I'm not that familiar with world building and I'd never written a novel before, I thought that would be kind of a shorthand way of me saying, okay, well, you guys are familiar with this and this and this, so I don't have to explain everything. The other thing was, I wanted to get people kind of comfortable, get the reader comfortable with thinking, okay, so this character is kind of like Batman, this character is kind of like Robin, and then their expectations kind of go in a certain direction and they start to feel comfortable in that. And then I wanted to pull the rug out from under them and say, yeah, guess what? This is not what you thought it was going to be.
Right. Was it difficult telling this kind of story, as a novel instead of as a graphic novel? One of the beautiful things about comics is some of the emotion, some of the action, and all of those things get to be told with a picture. And sometimes if an artist is great, it's done with subtlety in the picture so that the prose stands out and it enhances the words instead of just being a flip through, just glaze over it because you're like watching a movie. But when you don't have the visuals, do you have to be really careful to make sure that you get descriptors right and things like that so that you can pull the people into the world without the benefit of that other side?
Absolutely. I was worried about that, and I wasn't sure if it was going to work. I had actually read superhero novels before. I read a couple Batman ones.
There's not a ton of them.
And they
there's
didn't
not
pull me in.
There's
no,
not.
there isn't. Yeah. and they didn't pull me in, like you're saying. I didn't get that feeling I was reading a comic book. So I was worried about that, and it did take some doing for me to try to get it right. Hopefully I did okay at it. I think maybe screenwriting might have helped, because when you're writing a screenplay, you're trying to tell people what's going to be on the screen, basically. You have to describe the action in ways that people can picture in their heads. So I think that helped, that I had done that a lot. And I don't know, one of the things that gets frustrating is not repeating the same words over and over again when you're doing that kind of action. There's only so many ways to say certain things, and it's kind of crazy. Do them in different ways.
Right. Tell people a little bit about the hero and the sidekick in the story. They're loosely based on things we understand about Batman, and but these characters are not Batman and Robin. I can tell you that right now. I understand what you're saying about using that template, kind of, but you definitely made it something new and something your own. When you were sketching out these characters, what did you want to give these characters, and kind of what did you want the reader to take away from these characters?
So, even though Batman's always been my favorite character, I've always preferred Marvel Comics. To me, Marvel Comics were more realistic. They were based in mostly New York City, the real world. And DC was more of a fantasy world, and I've always liked the more realistic. So I wanted to take the kind of template of those DC characters, but kind of put it more in a Marvel kind of mindset, where it was more based in the real world, where people had real life problems. And I realized DC's come around over the years, but I'm thinking more of when I was a kid, and the comics I grew up with. And I wanted the reader to feel like they were real people, and that these were real problems, and worry about them, not think that they're going to just be okay at the end. So I didn't just say, okay, this character is just like Batman. It's more like, what if Tony Stark was Batman? And more of a, not someone pretending to be a billionaire playboy, but someone who kind of is a billionaire playboy and an alcoholic.
Narcissism is his superpower.
Right. And what if Robin wasn't, Tim Draker or Dick Grayson, but rather, someone like Peter Parker, who was like being bullied in school and trying to hide his powers. And I part of what I was trying to do was just tell a Marvel type of story with DC type of heroes, I guess. That's my way of describing it. So I liked the template of the sidekick, and Marvel hasn't done that a whole lot. They did it a little bit, but they haven't done that a whole lot.
Right.
DC, obviously, that was just something that just was almost automatic back in the old days. They had, every superhero almost had a sidekick that went along with it. And I think that having a young person as the main character would help young people relate a lot better than having an adult hero be the main character.
Right. When you're creating characters like this, and for a standalone project that doesn't have the history that if you or I went to work for Marvel or DC tomorrow, and we got to take over one of their flagship books, I can only imagine that that we would be on a very short leash with those characters. Mm-hmm. There was a comment on Facebook. I guess it was when the new Justice League trailer came out. It must have been during Comic-Con, and a bunch of people were speculating if that last little clip at the end of the Justice League trailer was Superman coming back, and someone commented and said, "But I thought he died," and I just laughed. I was like, "Well, you never assume that a comic book character is dead forever. That's
Right.
it's not going to happen. I'm sorry, you don't build a character that has a 75-year history and just kill them off. It's just not going to happen." But when you create a new character and you've got a new series and you really want to grab readers, you can do anything you want to with those characters. And that is not a spoiler for Sidekick. I'm not saying that anybody dies. So don't, if you haven't read it,
Yeah.
don't interpret what I'm saying as, what happens in the book. But you do have the freedom to do anything to these characters that you want. Does that ever, do you ever kind of play with that? Like, I can kill these people if I want to. I can introduce new characters that, like, this is my own new sandbox.
Yeah, definitely. That was one of the things I liked about doing my own universe and my own characters, was that I would get to choose to do those types of things. And I think that's one of the great things about certain TV shows like Battlestar Galactica and Breaking Bad, and Fargo, some of the more modern shows where you don't know if all the characters are going to make it through the series or even through any particular episode. The Walking Dead, and I think that was part of what I liked about writing in my own universe, and part of also the idea I was saying about pulling the rug out from under people is coming up with not necessarily characters dying per se, but things happening that would shock someone if they happened in the comic, because it just wouldn't happen in those worlds.
And if you're telling an engaging story, people are going to keep reading, whether you do something horrible to that main character or not. Talking about some modern TV shows, we watched Hell on Wheels when it was airing, and I remember my wife, there was a scene where something horrible was going to happen to one of the main characters, and my wife says, if they kill such and such person, I will never watch the show again. And they killed him. And the next Saturday night, we were there watching it to see what they were going to do with it.
Yep. Yep.
It was great. You also wrote a novel in the Legacy Fleet world called Formidable, and tell us about that book and getting involved in that project. Getting to play in an existing world, an extremely popular existing world, and kind of how did you jump in, and how did you kind of carve out your corner of the galaxy?
That was so much fun for me. I'm part of a group that you're also involved with called the Future Chronicles, Samuel Peralta's group, anthologies and so forth. And he decided to do an anthology for Kindle Worlds on Legacy Fleet stories, Nick Webb's universe, which is a really cool world that he's created and built up. And so Sam put out a call for authors who had read the Legacy Fleet books and wanted to, were willing to and able to write stories within a certain period of time. And it sounded really cool, but I actually hadn't read them yet. So immediately, like right when I hit the post, I bought and downloaded the audiobook of the first of Nick Webb's books on Constitution, and I listened to it. I spent the next few hours listening to it, and absolutely loved it. So I signed up to write a story. I already came up with an idea right away, and he chose me as one of the authors that would be in the first anthology, and then I listened to the other two books within the next couple of days, and then I started outlining my story, and so I created my own character in that world, but I made a connection to Nick's characters in that these characters are on board the ship that Nick's main character had been on before he was captain of the Constitution. So Tim Granger is the main character in the Legacy Fleet trilogy, and so I kind of came up with these ideas, and one of the absolute pleasures of doing it was that Nick was available to us to discuss things with. So I could go to him and say, is it okay if I do this, and would this work, and so forth, and he approved everything I was doing. And then some of us that were working on the anthology also had some similar ideas. There's something really important in the book that had happened in the past called the Korsky incident, and there were several of us that wanted to kind of touch on that in our stories. So we started a Facebook group that basically just to discuss what we were going to do so it didn't conflict, and Nick was part of it. So we went through that, and then by the time I was done with that, Nick asked those of us that were in the anthology if we would be interested in writing full novels. And so I decided to write a full novel about continuing the same character and the same story that I had done my original had my original idea for. And
was it easier or harder for you to kind of get the story started and kind of the what I guess what I'm asking, was it easier writing the story set in someone else's world, kind of like what we were talking about earlier with the set pieces already being in place where you could just kind of drop people into the story? Was that easier or harder?
For the most part, it was easier. The harder part was fitting in the timeline and making sure you can kind of didn't contradict what he had done. That part was a little complicated, but as far as just writing the story itself, I thought it was much easier. And after listening to those 3 books, the audiobooks all in a row, and doing, I got a little bit obsessed with it, to be honest. And I actually started or Nick started a wiki for us, and I actually went in and created most of the articles that are on the wiki to help the other authors keep track of things. So by the time I had done my research, it was kind of my old history research skills kicking in, but for a fictional universe, and so I kind of became expert on it. So it was really fun to just kind of drop my characters in, like you said, and I felt it was pretty easy. It was really fast for me to write. I felt really comfortable writing in that universe, and it just flowed really quickly. It just felt like I didn't have to push anything. It was just, I would sit down, it would just flow straight out of me.
I know that feeling when you kind of become obsessed with something,
Yeah.
and your family, kind of start staging interventions,
Yeah.
like, okay, we're not on the starship right now. Okay. Could you come back to dinner right now?
Yeah.
I think that's a writer thing. We become kind of obsessed with these characters that live inside our heads. But it's a good thing and a bad thing. I could see. You mentioned earlier that you're working on the sequel to Sidekick. You said you're almost finished with it? Is that right?
Yeah. It's almost done. I already have the cover done. The cover artist, John Boy Myers, actually worked with me at a small company back in the 90s. When he's younger than me, and he was really young at the time. And now he works for Marvel and DC, created stuff for World of Warcraft and other video game companies and stuff. And I loved the first cover, the cover for Sidekick. But the second one, which is going to be called Super Team, is just, it blows my mind that those are my characters when I look at the artwork. It's just he did such an amazing job. And when he posted the final version of it on his social media, people were going crazy for it. and saying they couldn't wait to pick up the books. So it's really exciting for me.
Nice. When do you think it might be out?
It should be out the end of September.
Awesome. All right. Well, we'll blast it out everywhere when it is. Christopher, thanks for taking time to come on the show today. It's been a blast talking to you.
Thank you. It was a great experience. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll put a link in the show notes to your Amazon page where folks can pick up all the books we talked about. But do you also have a website where people can go learn more about you?
Yeah, it's just www.christophervalin.com.
Excellent. Christopher, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you, Hank.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Tune in for new episodes every Tuesday and Friday. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Once and ago, Hulda said, land full of witches. Witches in the sky, in the trees, witches down the well. Justine, a great witch. Many herbs, many friends. One day, curse fall. Everyone die, everyone who believe in Hexe. This 1692. Hidden the knowledge is. The appointed hide it. A great curse cast in Salem that year. Legion, she cast curse to kill the day world. In New Amsterdam they not know, only see. Everyone die. What for? They blame Justine. Chased her off. She come here, I think. Hide from witch hunters. You, her blood.
Possibly Hulda was correct. I was a witch, just as she was. She promised my magic would come once I was a woman. I cannot say by what steps I came to believe Hulda's seductive promises of power, but I do know the moment when I chose to be a witch, irrevocably and with my whole heart. On the Sunday that Cornelia Van Cortlandt became Cornelia Beekman, the newly wedded pair made their first public appearance at church, their coming out, as was the custom, so that our poor congregation could thoroughly enjoy the spectacle of her bridal finery. The pair arrived late, with the whole bridal party in wedding array. Cornelia wore fawn-colored silk over a light blue damask petticoat. Gerard wore a waistcoat of the same, and a long coat of white broadcloth. After services, the Beekmans graciously shared the leftovers of their wedding feast, serving chicken and ale to the congregation, outside among the graves of the old burying ground. The day was pleasant and the grass sweet. The tenant farmers and peasant wives stood all hunched about, licking their fingers and making little bows of deference. Cornelia held a bouquet of orange blossoms to her cheek, and everyone agreed that she was the most beautiful young lady in all creation, married to the most good-natured and remarkable man. "That will be you some day," my mother whispered. The sun kissed Gerard's forehead as he reached into his purse and showered the graveyard with coins. All my neighbors fell to their knees at the couple's feet, scrabbling for pennies. Only I remained unbent. I stood, staring daggers into Cornelia, as she accepted a surreptitious kiss from her beautiful husband. Oh, that kiss in the graveyard. A perfect kiss of love and devotion and tribute. She noticed my expression of pain and mistook it for disappointment. "Did you not get a penny, dear?" she said, smiling. "Here you go." She threw her bouquet of orange blossoms to me. I caught it and gave her a tiny bow. Yes, I thought, that would be me some day. I crushed the bouquet to my heart and swore my oath. Cornelia would not win. She was no better than I. I was special, too. I wore no emeralds. I wore no silk, but I trailed fireflies. I deserved such a perfect kiss. I deserved such a perfect man. And if I could not win a god by grace, I would seize one by sorcery.